Hello, everybody. It's Tuesday night. No, it's not. It's Monday night. Planning on the storm tomorrow. Here's your online PowerPoint about schizophrenia. Like I've been saying in class, I think this is a pretty interesting unit, and I think schizophrenia might be the most interesting of the disorders. Let me see if I can give you some details about it. Somebody in sixth period said they wanted images with the slides, so I put some on. I found some stuff online that was supposedly done by artists who suffer from schizophrenia. I actually spent a little time trying to figure out if that was true. I don't know if it's true, but I'm not sure what to put with this, so I gave it a try. I like that one. So here's a little intro. Schizophrenia, the word literally means splitting of the mind. Not sure that's the best way to characterize it. I read one thing that said from somebody who suffers from it that it's more like a shattering of the mind. Note that schizophrenia is often confused with dissociative identity disorder, DID, which is what used to be multiple personality. So schizophrenics have a split mind, not a split personality. The two are unrelated. A better way to think of schizophrenia is that what split is your connection with reality. So the hallmark of schizophrenia is disturbed thinking, and someone who has it is psychotic, or psychosis is the disconnect between thought and emotion and reality. So that's a word we always use in just everyday language, or the mainstream world. Somebody's psychotic or psychosis, and you should make sure you understand what it means. It means somebody who's just untethered from reality. Okay, that's the intro. Some facts before we get into the diagnosis stuff. It affects somewhere about 0.7, 0.8% of people in the population, and that is similar in both the developing and the developed world. There's some idea that prognosis is slightly better in developing countries. They're not sure why. Maybe people are more tolerant for the symptoms or greater empathy for unusual people. It might be just differing methods of defining and assessing who's recovering. So it's not clear. What the similar rate across cultures, what does that suggest? That it's not purely a cultural disease, doesn't depend on society, but is more biological, that there's more of a biological basis. Similar rates for men and women, and generally people are diagnosed in their 20s or 30s, although there's evidence that the symptoms are starting to appear earlier in childhood. It's just not diagnosed. It is arguably the most devastating of the disorders we're going to study, both for those who have it and the friends and family who try to support them. Key characteristics, this is just one big sentence. Someone who suffers from schizophrenia has disturbed thinking, disturbed perception, disturbed behavior, and disturbed or inappropriate emotional responses. I'm going to go through the kind of keys to the diagnosis, and you should be able to link them back to which one is thinking, which one's perception, etc. So here's a more specific diagnosis than I'm doing with the other ones, just because I think it's helpful to understand the disorder. So the big thing would be the 5 elements on category A. Delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms, meaning a lack of symptoms. So let me just talk about these 5 for a little bit, then I'll get into details on them more on the following slides. Um, First of all, you have to have two or more of them. But you have to have at least one of the first three. So you have to be delusional or having hallucinations or the disorganized speech. So you have to have one of those three and 2 out of the 5 overall. Um, the first 4 are called positive symptoms. They're excesses. They're additional behaviors that somebody has. They're not positive in the sense of being good. They're just additional behaviors. And then the 5th, negative symptoms, would be deficits, things that people lack. So those 5 are kind of the big part of diagnosing someone with schizophrenia. In addition, you have to have an impaired level of functioning in some major area of your life: work, getting along with other people, self-care, so that before onset you were functioning at a certain level, and you have to be significantly impaired below that to be diagnosed with it. Third is length. It's got to be at least 6 months. Usually someone who has a disorder will experience the symptoms for much longer than that, but it has to be at least 6 months. So that's the diagnosis. And then just as kind of a final thing, sorry, the other disorders have to be ruled out. So this would be a fairly important slide. Be sure you've got those straight. I'm going to go through the category A in a little more detail in just a couple slides. Used to be categories and subtypes. The book Ciccarelli actually has this wrong, where it goes through 3 different subtypes: paranoid, disorganized, catatonic. That's not like that anymore. Those features of the disorder still exist, but they're not different categories under it. It's now part of the schizophrenia spectrum. You don't have to know the details on there, but you can see it on that slide below. Just different schizophrenia, is right here, and there are these related disorders along the spectrum. Okay, let's talk about the first one, delusions. I like that photo. Delusion is a false belief based on kind of an incorrect conclusion about reality. There are a number of common delusions. The false belief that you're being persecuted, that's one you're probably familiar with, that people are out to get me. This one takes a little bit of explaining. The delusion of reference is the idea, or referential delusion is the idea that you think stuff is referring to you when it has nothing to do with you. So you think the news in the newspaper or on the TV is about you. That's a delusion of reference. Very common or a well-known one is delusion of grandeur, when you think you're very important and way more powerful than you really are. That's what is happening to our little kitten there to the right. Delusion of identity is when you think that you are somebody you're not, like Muhammad or Jesus Christ or Taylor Swift or something. Delusion of guilt is that you have this delusion you've committed a terrible sin. And the delusion of control is the idea that your thoughts or behaviors are being controlled by external forces. So those are probably delusions, most of them you've heard before, and that's the first big element of schizophrenia. The second big one, maybe the most common symptom, would be hallucinations, false sensory perceptions without any kind of external source. So you perceive these things in your brain, in your mind, that don't actually exist in reality. They're vivid, they're clear, they seem real to the person. The most common would be voices, that you hear voices, so auditory hallucinations. But more rarely they can be visual, smells, or even, somatosensory. The voices are often accusatory, accusing you of something or commanding you to do things. You are evil. You're inept, or asking you to do dangerous things. Sometimes it's just this whole cacophony of sounds with voices intermingled. I thought that piece of artwork was a pretty good match. So that's the second big one, hallucinations. The cause of the hallucinations physically in your brain is unclear. Um, if they do neuroimaging, the cortical areas that process external sensory stimuli. So I don't know if you remember that from the S&P unit. We talked about the primary sensory areas and then the association areas. This would occur in the association areas. Um, for the auditory, it's in the areas that are activated when people engage in inner speech. Um, there's speculation that the auditory hallucinations are caused by a difficulty in the person distinguishing what's normal inner speech from external sounds. So just kind of your inner monologue, they have trouble realizing that that's an inner monologue and attribute it to um, external voices talking to them. So that's the second one. Disorganized speech is just kind of incoherence, the failure to follow a train of thought or a normal conversational structure. Um, if asked questions, they might come back with kind of uh, go off on a tangent or come back with irrelevant info. There's what's known as a loosening of associations that makes it difficult to follow. Here's an example from somebody who is schizophrenic. They're destroying too many cattle and oil just to make soap. If we need soap when you can jump into a pool of water, and then when you can go to buy your gasoline, my folks always thought they could get pop, but the best thing to get is motor oil and money. May as well go there and trade in some pop cans and tires and tractors to car garages so they can pull cars away from wrecks, is what I believed in. That's a nice example of, that the words sort of make sense up to a point, but then they jump and shift, and you end up with it's kind of meaningless. Um, that would be an example of the loosening of associations. You can also get something called a word salad, which is just, the real words, but they're almost entirely random, no syntax or structure, even less so than that paragraph I just read. Um, the jumbling of words can also involve something called clang associations, which is just a string of words that rhyme but have no other apparent link. That's the third one. So those are the big three. To get diagnosed with schizophrenia, you have to have at least one of those three: delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. And you also get disorganized behavior. Schizophrenics often act strangely. They can be agitated unpredictably. They can be childishly silly. Some examples would be wearing multiple layers of clothing on hot days, um, walking along the street muttering to yourself, alternating rapidly with no kind of logic between anger and laughter, um, pacing along and wringing your hands as if you're extremely worried. Those are all examples of disorganized behavior, or the strange acting. In this category is also poor hygiene. Sometimes schizophrenics fail to bathe or change their clothes regularly. Um, Problems performing a lot of activities, um, daily activities, and that interferes with daily living. Another type of disorganized behavior is called catatonic behavior, and that is when the person becomes just very decreased in their responsiveness to the environment. They can remain immobilized in one position for hours. You get, if in the face, kind of a rigid mask-like expression with eyes staring into the distance. Um, you might also see someone exhibit echolalia, which is mindlessly repeating words they hear. Um, there's speculation that this catatonic behavior may be an extreme fear response, similar to how animals freeze at sudden dangers. The person is said to be literally scared stiff. So when you think about, I want to go back to, sorry, I'm going to scroll back for a little bit here. disturbed thinking, perception, behavior, and inappropriate emotional responses. The disturbed thinking would be delusions. Disturbed perception would be hallucinations. The disturbed behavior would be that third category, disorganized behavior, and that's the fourth category, sorry, and speech. And then the fifth one we'll talk about would be the inappropriate emotional responses. Okay, just tying it all together for you. Okay, the negative symptoms. So those were all positive symptoms or excesses. Here are the deficits. People with schizophrenia often avoid eye contact and seem apathetic. They can have flat affect. So affect is how much kind of tone and emotion do you have in your facial expressions and in your tone of voice. So they don't express emotion very much. Their speech can be slowed. They actually will speak less, not just more slowly, but have less to say. Speak in a monotone, lots of pauses, and they won't complete. That was a joke. They won't complete sentences after starting them. There's also a reduction in just overt behavior as well. Movements are slowed, little initiation of behavior, and less interest in social participation. Negative symptoms are more common in men than women. This results in a poorer prognosis. Women tend to recover from schizophrenia better than men because women tend to have more of the positive symptoms, and those are more treatable by medication. So antipsychotic medications are helpful in reducing the positive symptoms, less so with the negative. The antipsychotic medications act on the whole neurotransmitter system in our brain. The negative systems may be associated less with abnormal neurotransmitter levels and just abnormal brain anatomy. And so that if you do the medications that affect the neurotransmitters, it might not affect the brain anatomy. There's some psychiatrists who speculate that schizophrenia with negative symptoms is actually a totally different disorder because it has these underlying difference in the brain. Okay, so those are your 5 big symptoms. I took a lot of time on that. Hopefully it's clear. Now this causes thing is going to be less clear. They spent a lot of time trying to understand the causes of schizophrenia. They're complex and still not well understood. The early theories were that the mom somehow simultaneously accepted and rejected the children. There's no evidence to support that. A couple of things we do know. It runs in families. Genetics clearly play a role. No single gene is connected to schizophrenia. It's actually a complex of genes. It's primarily a brain disorder, and I'll talk about that. And environmental factors definitely have an effect. Let's talk about each of those. Biological causes. The book does a good job talking about how it runs in families, and genetics clearly plays a role. If one twin develops, then and they're identical, there's about a 48% chance of the other twin developing it. But if they're fraternal twins, there's only a 17% chance. So that's a clear indication that it's genetic and not just that they're raised in the same environment. The book has other information about the connection, the genetic connection. But no single gene causes schizophrenia. It's likely that multiple genes or mutations contribute kind of in subtle ways to the expression of the disorder. People with schizophrenia have rare mutations of their DNA about 3 to 4 times more often than healthy individuals, and especially in the genes related to brain development. There are over 100 candidate genes that potentially have an influence on the development of schizophrenia. So while our ability to map the brain and look at genetics has expanded tremendously in the last 10 to 20 years, the disease is complicated, so it's still difficult to tease out what exactly is going wrong. But they do know what happens in the brain. Um, the ventricles are the areas that supply blood to throughout the brain, and those are enlarged. In other words, the actual brain tissue is reduced, so there's less brain matter. Um, the greater the reduction in brain tissue, the more severe the symptoms. And over time, longitudinally, the brain tissue tends to shrink even more. The reductions in brain tissue happen in a number of regions of the brain, especially the frontal lobes and the medial temporal lobes. Um, one possibility with schizophrenia is that there are abnormalities in neurotransmitters. And I already talked about how um, antipsychotic medications can play a role in reducing the symptoms or helping people recover. Dopamine may play an important role. It's possible that there are drugs, antipsychotic drugs that block dopamine activity, and those decrease the symptoms. Um, drugs that increase dopamine activity increase the symptoms. However, it's not just a simple thing of too much dopamine. Other neurotransmitters appear to be involved as well, and there are some parts of the brain where that excess dopamine idea is not true. Um, there's also less white matter in schizophrenics, and if you remember, gray matter is the axonal and synaptic ends of the nerves. The white matter would, sorry, I said that wrong. The white matter would be the long axons because they're myelinated with the fatty tissue. The gray matter would be the connections between the nerves. Um, so there's speculation that the glial cells that make up that myelin sheath, if you remember from Unit 2, that there may be an abnormality there. So what do we have so far? We've got an idea that genetics clearly play a role. There's clearly something wrong with the brain, less brain tissue, possibly something with neurotransmitters, possibly something with the glial cells. Um, Finally, environmental factors. Genetics don't account fully for the onset of the disease and its severity. So other factors, environmental factors, must also be at work. If it was fully genetic, then identical twins would have it with 100% concordance instead of 50%. Um, environmental stress definitely appears to contribute to the onset. If you remember the diathesis stress model, that people might be predisposed and then stress brings it out. In Ciccarelli, they call it the stress vulnerability model. It's a really interesting study. Um, they have adopted children whose biological mothers were schizophrenic. So what that says is they clearly are vulnerable or predisposed to it genetically. Um, if the adopted families were psychologically healthy, none of them became psychotic. Nobody developed schizophrenia. But if the adopted families were also disturbed, then a certain percent became psychotic, and a large percentage, almost half, developed severe psychological disorders, not necessarily schizophrenia. More generally, um, it appears that a dysfunctional family situation increases the risk. There's much higher likelihood of somebody developing schizophrenia. There's some speculation that urban environments, because of their stress and the chaos, produce elevated levels of schizophrenia. It's about 2 times the risk. And then finally, there's some speculation that there's something called a schizovirus, which sounds like a made-up thing, but maybe it isn't. Colds and viruses are more likely to spread in urban environment. Antibodies in the blood of people with schizophrenia were found that are not found in those without the disorder. So They seem like they've been exposed to a different virus. Um, Mothers of schizophrenics were more likely to have contracted the flu during the second trimester, an important time for fetal brain development. So that's a theory. It's possible, but it's not anywhere close to being proven right now. So in conclusion, um, it's a severe disorder, it can be devastating, heartbreaking, um, but many respond to treatment and function well. Up to like 40% do very well. Um, John Nash, for example, portrayed in the movie A Beautiful Mind, suffered for decades um, with delusions of persecution and severe form of schizophrenia, but he recovered and was able to perform math at an extremely high level, one of the most brilliant people in the world, for many years after his recovery. And he actually just died recently in 2015. He was killed in a car crash with his wife. They were hit by somebody else. Um, about 10 to 15% of the homeless suffer from schizophrenia. That's an example that there was a movie with Jamie Foxx who played Nathaniel Ayres, the soloist, who was a Juilliard trained violinist, and that's a photograph of him in the background. Um, it's an important example of many concepts from the course: nature and nurture, diathesis stress model, neurotransmitters and brain anatomy, and an abnormal form of cognition, perception, motor control, and emotion. So a tough illness or disorder, but one that's very interesting that ties together a lot of concepts. And that's it. Um, See you back in class sometime.